Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and students to this first Engage webinar called Sanctions and War, the EU's Restrictive Measures and the Russian Invasion of Ukraine. It's a pleasure for me to be hosting this online event. My name is Gustavo Müller. I'm Senior Researcher at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven, Belgium, which is a partner of the Engage Consortium. As we saw in this short video, Engage is an Horizon 2020 project that brings together 13 academic institutions and think tanks from across Europe. It examines how the EU can effectively and sustainably meet its strategic challenges by harnessing all of its tools and become a more assertive global actor. You can know more about Engage by checking its website, that is engage-eu.eu, and subscribe to its newsletter. If you did not catch the website, it will be posted on the chat box as well. Now moving on to today's topic. Since the beginning of the Russian war in Ukraine in February this year, the European Union has mobilized multiple tools of its external action to respond to Russian aggression in Europe. Chiefly among these tools are the restrictive measures, or simply put, sanctions. To date, the EU and its member states have introduced 5 sanction packages with the goal of, quote unquote, curtailing the Russian ability to wage war. Now the discussion has shifted towards a possible 6th package, and we're going to talk about that today, this time with a focus on the oil flowing from Russia to EU countries. At the same time, experts have raised multiple issues on the efficacy, the legitimacy, and the impact of sanctions themselves. Will, for instance, sanctions bring Russia to the negotiation table? Will they lead to changes in the regime? Will they impact those responsible for the key decisions in the Kremlin? How does the EU, for example, decide on restrictive measures, and how will they impact EU citizens as a whole? To discuss these and many other questions, we have invited 3 specialists for this first Engage webinar. Wouters is full professor of international law in international organizations. He is Jean Monnet Chair ad personam on European Union and Global Governance, and founding director of the Institute for International Law and the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven. He has published widely on issues pertaining to EU external relations law, European human rights law, global governance, and beyond. We also have here with us today Ana Hernández Sierra. She is a Spanish diplomat who has devoted the greatest part of her career to the common foreign and security policy of the European Union. She's also a PhD candidate at the University of Salamanca in Spain, where she focuses her research activity on the development of the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice regarding, in particular, EU restrictive measures. Last but not least, we also have with us today Dr. Viktor Szép. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Groningen, with an academic background in both law for his PhD and international relations for his master's degree. Viktor's interdisciplinary research focuses on the legal and political dimensions of EU's foreign policy and sanctions policies. In 2021, so last year, Viktor defended his PhD on the European Union sanctions against Russia. Now, all of our panelists have kindly accepted to talk to us about the rationale and the consequences and the whole process behind sanctions, and we thank all 3 of them, to be here with us today. I suggest that we start with Viktor, and that will be followed then by Anna and Jan. Each of our panelists will give us an initial talk of 10 minutes, which will be followed then by a Q&A with you, the audience. You can reach us by asking questions via the Q&A button, which is usually found at the bottom of your screen. Do not hesitate to ask as many questions as you like. We promise we're going to try to answer them all in the short time that we have, though, which is 1 hour. Without further ado, then, let me pass on the floor to Viktor for his initial talk of around 10 minutes. Viktor, thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gustavo, and thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. So as you said, I'm going to basically talk about sanctions in 2 parts. First, I'm going to give you a short introduction into European Union sanctions, and then right after that, I'm going to talk specifically about Russian sanctions. So in the European Union, sanctions are officially called restrictive measures, as also Gustavo said, and they can take different forms, including travel bans, arms embargoes, financial or economic sanctions and diplomatic sanctions and so on and so forth. They are targeted measures in the sense that the EU sanctions do not take the form of full embargo, but at the same time, they are increasingly broader in scope, as the case of Russia, but also other cases have demonstrated. In the European Union, sanctions policy is an area which is very much dominated by the member states. The decision-making procedure leading to the adoption of sanctions is complicated, and we can talk about it during the Q&A session. But long story short, the establishment of a sanctions regime requires basically unanimity in the Council. And therefore, in some cases, the reluctance of a single member state may slow down the European Union's ability to impose sanctions against a particular state. Take the example of the sanctions imposed against Belarus in 2020, when Cyprus delayed European Union sanctions even in a crisis when the European Union's actions were much needed. In general, sanctions are increasingly used in the European Union to tackle different challenges. In the 1990s, if you look back 30 years back, we only had a handful of sanctions regimes, but today we have more than 30 of them, including also some horizontal sanctions regimes. Some of these sanctions regimes are the result of a UN Security Council resolutions, but others are so-called autonomous measures in the sense that they are taken by the EU in the absence of a UN Security Council resolution. Now, let me turn to the specific case of Russia. So, of course, EU sanctions didn't start in 2022. I guess many of you know that. So sanctions have been imposed since 2014, mostly because Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula and then destabilized eastern Ukraine. In 2014, sanctions were imposed in 3 phases after difficult negotiations, and the bulk of sanctions, so the sectoral sanctions, only came during the summer of 2014 after downing of a passenger aircraft. But even if sectoral sanctions were imposed against Russia in 2014, member states were careful in their approach and didn't want to adopt broader sanctions that would have, touched upon the import of gas and oil back in 2014. Indeed, in the sanctions community, it is usually said that if the sanctions against Iran, which was, a maximum pressure campaign, was 10 out of 10, then the sanctions against Russia was something like 2 out of 10 back in 2014. Obviously, things have changed significantly since 2014. First, in the European Union, we could witness the emergence of horizontal sanctions regimes, which target individuals and entities irrespective of their geographical locations. These include, for example, the European Union's chemical weapons sanctions regime, or cyber attack sanctions regime, or human rights sanctions regime. And one of the features of these sanctions regimes is that they all target Russian individuals and entities. Second, perhaps more importantly, of course, the sanctions adopted in 2022 went beyond most of our expectations. Let me say something about the preconditions of effectiveness of these measures. So first, sanctions are effective when you have multilateral support for them. So cooperation in sanctions is very important. In fact, whenever the European Union imposes sanctions, it rarely does it alone. Within Europe, the common practice is that the High Representative invites third countries to join the European Union's pre-cooked sanctions regime. So take the example of the EFTA countries, such as Norway, Liechtenstein, but also take the example of candidate states that basically who are invited to implement pre-cooked European Union sanctions regime. This is what happened in the case of Russia. So many European states, not only the 27 member states of the European Union, but also European states with no EU membership implemented European Union sanctions. Of course, there are some exceptions. So if you look at the case of Serbia, you could see that Serbia is still reluctant to implement European Union sanctions against Russia. On the other hand, take the example of Switzerland. Switzerland that likes to emphasize its neutral status implemented some of the European Union sanctions regime. Outside of Europe, the picture is a little bit more complicated because the European Union cannot simply invite major powers to join its pre-cooked sanctions regime. Instead, the European Union, the United States, and other like-minded countries coordinate mostly in the G7, which used to be G8 before 2014, when Russia was basically kicked out as a result of its actions back in 2014. So now you have the G7, which brings together like-minded states, and there you have cooperation. From a scientific perspective, it's a little bit hard to examine the G7 cooperation because much cooperation is informal. But however, we know that cooperation takes place in G7. And then you can see what happened in 2022. Major sanctions against Russia were imposed collectively by the United States, by the European Union, but also by other like-minded states. I'm not saying, and I'm not arguing that there is a complete harmony, but you can say that that this was almost a never-seen intensity cooperation between G7 countries. Second, concerning the effectiveness, sanctions are rarely used in isolation from other foreign policy tools, which is also done to increase the effectiveness of these measures. As you could see, besides of imposing sanctions, the European Union offered the possibility to welcome Ukraine as a member in the European Union. Of course, we'll see what happens with this membership possibility, but this is also part of the strategy. You could also see that some of the member states offered arms to Ukraine, and so on and so forth. We could talk about these foreign policy and other types of instruments that are part of this broader strategy of the European Union, but also other like-minded states to basically to help Ukraine to preserve its territorial integrity. Now let me talk about the major sanctions. Basically, when the first wave of sanctions were imposed against Russia, what we could see is that the Russian financial system was targeted. First, many people talked about the SWIFT. The SWIFT was considered as the exclusion from the SWIFT was considered as the nuclear weapon of sanctions. It's basically not the nuclear weapon of all sanctions because SWIFT is a messaging system. Of course, it's a very effective messaging system, and if you get out of SWIFT, then it's hard to communicate with other financial institutions and with other banks, but still you can do that. Of course, the alternatives are most costly, less efficient. So if you are out of the SWIFT, then the life becomes much more difficult. But at the same time, you could see that Russia tried to build its alternative, but this alternative is not very effective because less financial institutions are connected to the Russian version of SWIFT. Much less financial messages are going through the system. So if you're out of the SWIFT, then your life becomes much harder. However, what really hit the Russian financial system is the target of the foreign reserve of Russia. Now, as you may know, the foreign reserves of Russia was made, at least half of it was made of either US dollar or euro or pound. Now, half of them was basically targeted by sanctions, and immediately you could see that that had an immediate impact on the Russian financial system, because those foreign reserves couldn't be used by the Russian state to underpin, to support the ruble and the Russian financial system, and therefore it had an immediate impact. My last sentence. Of course, as you could have seen, many packages of sanctions have been already adopted. Now we are talking about the sixth package, which will possibly include sanctions on oil, which is a major, development in sanctions policy if accepted. Because, as you could have seen, the energy question really divided the member states. But we could see that France supported those actions. Now Germany also supports the actions. Now the big question, what will happen with Hungary and Slovakia? Based on the recent news, we could see that some derogations will be applied concerning Hungary and Slovakia. We don't know yet. And by the way, we know some solutions how oil and other types of energy sanctions could be applied, also because of the US applied similar strategy in the case of Iran. So we have something in our mind, but given that I am now talking about something like 11 minutes and I'm only allowed to talk about 10 minutes, so I'm going to stop here, but I'm going to be very happy to take your questions and looking forward for a very good discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Viktor. And you're definitely going to be allowed to speak more because some questions are already coming in. Let me remind you, the audience, that you can use the Q&A button to ask questions, especially if you want to guarantee that your question will be answered. The faster you do ask questions, the more likely it will be answered. So please do not hesitate. Thank you, Viktor, once again. We're going to move on straight to Anna for her initial talk as well. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gustavo, for inviting me to this roundtable organized in the framework of the project Engage Consortium, and of course for the support of the KU Leuven. It's a great honor, as the previous Viktor has already expressed. It's a great honor for me to be part of this panel, and hopefully I would be able to contribute with some ideas to this very interesting discussion. I just wanted to make a very short clarification. Well, as you have said, I work for a ministry, so the opinions I am going to express in this roundtable are exclusively mine, and they do not commit my ministry or they are any kind of official line. But I will, as an observer of the world of sanctions on the CFSP, I would try also to give my input to this roundtable. And just some comments to start. Well, Viktor has set the framework in a very, very comprehensive way. So it's good that we can start building upon from these ideas that Viktor has already used to depict a bit the situation we're in. For me, also, we have to take in mind a bit the political context of where we are to understand why sanctions are, why we're using certain working methods, or why we are cooperating with the countries, or where the main challenges lie. First, the Russia's unlawful military aggression against Ukraine is a game changer, not only for the EU, for the worldwide, and the war in Ukraine is an absolute priority for the European Union, and that has definitely an impact on the priorities of the European Union, and of course on the CFSP, but not only, because somehow this situation has had spread the consequences in the rest of policy of the European Union right now. That is because this aggression is an existential threat for the European Union, something that we have not seen in the previous decades. Also taking in mind that we have seen the development of the CFSP since the beginning of the 90s with the Maastricht Treaty and so on. And since then, we haven't had such an existential threat against the European Union. So we have to take that also in mind. Many red lines, as Viktor have mentioned, have been crossed. We are in a very different world context. And of course, the response has also been very, very different. From the technical point of view of the CFSP and of sanctions, the first consequences to me are clear, and I will try to give you an idea of that. First, this has been a unifying factor for member states when taking decisions. That has had an impact in the working methods which have been used, and that has been also unprecedented in the speed and in the ambition of the restrictive measures that have been adopted. Definitely, that has been an external cohesive factor, and we are still seeing that. Now, well, we can read in the press, and sometimes we can hear some criticism regarding if they are taking too long in deciding about the sixth package of sanctions. Of course, the more sectors which are already covered, and the more people you have already targeted of different groups of people, well, the more difficult it is to define and to design which other sanctions can be adopted. So, of course, this fine-tuning needs a bit of time. But I would like to recall that the first package of sanctions was taken within the first 48 hours after the aggression. So that is we haven't seen that before. Not even when the aggression against Crimea in 2014. We have also to recall that the war started on the 24th February, and a bit later than 2 months later, that date, we are already discussing the sixth package. So again, the ambition and the speedy work of the council in this case, and in the commission when defining also the sectoral measures and so on, is something we have to be proud of. Also, in terms of how this has affected the working methods, the preparatory work has been crucial, and the EU has also shown an important capacity to thinking ahead, of being proactive, of being prepared, and this has also been key in this SPD response. Additionally, well, Viktor mentioned that many taboos have been broken about also the content of our restrictive measures. Viktor mentioned SWIFT. He mentioned also the assets of the Russian central bank abroad. But not only in terms of sanctions, we have today, this afternoon, we are talking about sanctions, but also in other domains on the CFSP. For instance, the first time that the European Union is sending lethal equipment to a war which is to a country which is at war. So this, as I said, this is only another evidence of how things have changed in this within this short period of history. Additionally, the decision making, as I said, has been incredibly smooth. Even if we need unanimity, we have seen that and we have witnessed that. And as I said, well, of course, the longer this and sadly this war will take, well, the more prepared we have to be to find then where in which specific aspects we can still be effective through sanctions. The second thing I wanted to underline is that we can also observe a change on the goal of sanctions, if we compare that with other regimes. Normally, we are used to see the use of restrictive measures by the European Union in a context where the Council is acting, or the European Union is acting to exert a certain kind of leverage or to change behavior, normally of actors. Now, the basic line of our sanctions is defend ourselves and repeal this attack, not directly, well, which is basically affecting Ukraine, but indirectly it's affecting the European Union by, as you have mentioned at the very beginning, and it's already reflected in the legal acts and has been publicly acknowledged and repeated, to weaken Russia's economy's base, depriving it of critical technologies market significantly, curtailing its availability to wage war, and, well, in conclusion, to avoid that they have the financial resources to keep this bloodshed. So if we keep this in mind, we have to understand, or it's easier to understand, how we can assess the real effectiveness of sanctions. Because in my opinion, you can only assess effectiveness if you really have into account what's the scope of the measure. And the parameters of the analysis might vary a lot, but first, and before drawing conclusions on that, we have to repeat ourselves again that the first goal and scope of these new restrictive measures is basically to defend ourselves against this existential threat. And this has, again, nothing to do with other situations where the EU has applied or has adopted sanctions. So therefore, many steps are also being taken to close loopholes, to avoid circumvention, to seek alignment. Viktor also mentioned that, to improve cooperation, to convince fence setters, these third countries that are somehow aware close to Russia, which are still close to Russia, but at the same time, they have certain interest in keeping good relations with the European Union. Well, we can name many of them. That is important for us, and therefore outreach is also one of the key pillars of this strategy of sanctions. Also, keeping in mind, and perhaps we can have this discussion in another roundtable. Well, certain actors might raise from time to time the use or the advantages of using in an extraterritorial way sanctions. Well, the European Union does not, because we cannot simply, because of legal system, we cannot apply sanctions extraterritorially, as opposite to the United States, for instance. So therefore, in order to have as much as effectiveness as possible and cooperation with the countries and avoid that Russia finds other ways to circumvent sanctions, well, the outreach, as I said, is key, and that will also link to the question of the narrative that I will touch upon a bit later. The third consequence for me, and the third characteristic of this situation of the adoption of restrictive measures in this context, is the cooperation with like-minded partners. Well, Viktor has already said a lot about that, but I think it's worth it to underline some aspects. The needs for coordination match the magnitude of the challenge. It is true we also come from a situation in which the US administration was already quite prone to working with us on sanctions. Also after Brexit, the UK has been a key actor within the European Union in the design and adoption and implementation of sanctions. They have a very important expertise and know-how in sanctions. Now they are outside the European Union, and of course, we are like-minded. Otherwise, we couldn't say the opposite in the realm of sanctions, because somehow we have developed in the same context. So therefore, we have these two previous elements to the war, and as Viktor said, now the real importance or the real cooperation is within the G7. Here we have also seen important steps, not only with countries that normally will use similar sanctions to ours. I'm saying similar because, well, the legal framework is also very different. For instance, Canada, but we are also seeing how, for instance, Japan, which is a country that normally they hadn't used sanctions as we do in general terms. Now they are trying to catch up with all the designations and so on. So again, this is a game changer in this context of the G7. Continuous conversations take place, sharing information, comparing notes, discussing ideas, analyzing lessons learned at all levels. Of course, every country has a different presentation. Sometimes, well, Viktor already mentioned that. Well, that does not mean that we replicate exactly the same sanctions, but they go more or less on the same in the same line. I don't see the need to formalize this format. I think one of the virtues of this cooperation is that it's not formalized. We also, from the point of view of the European Union, we have certain kind of restrictions in the sense that, our own decision-making process has different steps. So we cannot cooperate, for instance, on with third countries when we haven't decided, or member states in the Council have not decided on which measures exactly would be part of a package. So the dialogue is completely open. The exchange of information is very fluent, but we have to keep in mind our context, and we have our own way of making decisions because we are 27 member states. So of course this is something that must be taken into account, and the importance is key, as Viktor has mentioned on that, and I'm sure that we will have questions about that. Only really by joining efforts and keeping a clear strategy among partners, we will increase our possibilities to make these sanctions as effective as possible and to reach our goal, which is basically, as we said, to stop the war. And I don't want to take much more time, but just a fourth consequence for me, or a fourth aspect that we need to also to mention is we have the EU, I think, has also understood the importance of working on the narrative, basically because we're also in a context of disinformation, of manipulation of information and of propaganda, basically. And that has also an effect of the countries. In the sense, how do I link that with the restrictive measures? Well, normally the narrative, the countries which are target of restrictive measures, and this is not an exception with Russia nowadays, is that, well, they exploit a bit the argument of that sanctions harm the population and so on. Well, the sanctions of the European Union are especially designed to avoid unintended consequences in the population. I think in this case it's clear, but of course we really have to work, and it's even more concerning, I think, to work on this narrative with third countries that perhaps are starting to suffer from the food crisis, which are starting suffering from the energy crisis, and Russia is repeating that this is directly linked to these Western sanctions. We have to stop this idea immediately, and of course be very clear that the only responsible for that is Putin behavior. In addition, we can also see in the legal acts that these sanctions have included important humanitarian exceptions that have been specified or adapted to the context of this war. So in this sense, also this aspect of joining also the narrative to the sanctions is also a key aspect. And just to conclude, well, we keep on repeating that sanctions are not an end in themselves. It's the main tool, it is true, that we are using, or one of the main tools we are using to wage this war. But sanctions are also coming in a combination with diplomacy, with other instruments of the CFSP toolbox. And just to mention that we will also, it will be also interesting to see what the Court of Justice will say about some of the cases that will be dealt with in the court.
Thank you so much, Anna, for shedding so much light on how ambitious and unprecedented these sanctions have been in this case, and also for showing that there's more to it than sanctions, right? Particularly the weapons transfer example, I found it particularly relevant. And the last point I would highlight, and I would definitely try to come back to it later on, is the changing of the basic rationale from the objective of changing the behavior of the other actor to the objective of that's more fundamental of defending Europe and the European Union and so on. I'm going to come back to that, but before, let me pass on the floor to Jan, who has the difficult task to speak last. Jan, on to you.
Thank you so much, Gustavo. I'm not entirely sure what is there still to be added to these great interventions, but let me just develop three brief reflections. First of all, and this is an overall statement, doesn't have to do specifically with the sanctions against Russia, but I mean, the EU's sanction policy is a very interesting field. But to be honest, who has the overview? I wonder sometimes who in Brussels has the full picture of all the sanction schemes that the EU has developed in the course of time and that are still in place. I'm a little bit, say, surprised that if you want to have an overview of EU sanctions, you have to go to a non-EU website. The sanctionsmap.eu website is not an official EU website if you want to see what sanctions are in force against which countries on what particular thematic issues. So my first remark is actually, I think we are in need of a fuller overview and more transparency and clarity with regard to the sanction schemes against, say, many countries that are in force at the level of the European Union, including against Russia, Belarus, and so on. Secondly, there is, of course, the big issue that sanctions are part of CFSP, or the Common Foreign and Security Policy, and that therefore, in principle, they are subject to the unanimity principle in the Council of Ministers. And I know this is, of course, a bit of a refrain for specialists in EU CFSP law, but the big question still remains with us. How are we going to cope with this decision-making mode of unanimity in the future? We are constantly being blackmailed, kept up by the member states that are not entirely cooperative. The example was given of Cyprus in the case of the Belarus sanctions, but of course there is now for the sixth package also the threat of a Hungarian veto. We still don't know if it will play out. Usually it's a bargaining chip, and as you know, there are some good chips to be bargained against, including the EU conditionality regime. But I mean, there is always the threat and the risk that sanctions will not be adopted, or at least will lose their comprehensive and biting features. This is an evergreen in CFSP, and we know that already the previous Commission, Juncker, in 2018 has made proposals to go for more qualified majority voting. It was Juncker himself who basically called for what he said in German, Weltpolitikfähigkeit of the European Union. We should really have more capacity to act as a global player, and that applies also to the field of sanctions in the area of CFSP. In the Juncker Commission in 2018, interestingly enough, towards the end of their mandate, published a communication in which they essentially said, let's go for qualified majority voting in the area of sanctions, in the area of human rights, and in the area of launching civil missions in CFSP. President von der Leyen herself, we may remember that, has called in a State of the Union address in September 2020 for qualified majority voting, especially when it is about implementing sanctions and on human rights issues. One will also probably remember that when as a designated president, von der Leyen sent her mission letters to the various commissioners, that she sent in her letter to Mr. Borrell, basically the task of exploring the possible use of other treaty provisions in order to overcome the unanimity principle. I'm not entirely sure what has come out of those efforts of Mr. Borrell, but we see, of course, that the unanimity rule is still there. And I really wonder whether we have already tapped all the potential of the current EU treaties to overcome the unanimity principle. It always struck me, for instance, that in the area of the common foreign and security policy, we have not properly made use of the so-called mechanism of enhanced cooperation. There are mechanisms in the treaties, such as the possibility of the European Council requesting the High Rep to come up with an initiative and thereby forcing the Council to adopt the measure with qualified majority. Of course, the problem then moves to the level of the European Council, where we have maybe other players that are not keen on overcoming the unanimity principle. But so there are ways, and in my view, there are even ways under public international law. Let's not forget that in order to overcome some of the major hurdles to save the Eurozone, at a certain moment, the EU has made, well, the European leaders have had recourse to intergovernmental treaties, such as the Fiscal Compact Treaty and so on, in order to basically overcome vetoes, but also to introduce necessary measures to save the Eurozone. Well, if really necessary, why don't we also make an intergovernmental treaty, for instance, to try to have sanctions or other forceful foreign policy measures that can be taken with 26, if need be with 25 and so on. I hope we never will have to go lower than 25, because then it becomes a little bit patchy. But in any event, overcoming the unanimity principle. This is not just about sanctions, restrictive measures. This is also about the EU's presence in the United Nations, in the various United Nations bodies, such as the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly in New York, where indeed we have to make sure important EU positions and initiatives cannot be blocked by just one or even two member states that are not in agreement with a particular issue. I think that's about it for my initial introduction. I would be happy to also say something about the debate whether EU restrictive measures are fully compatible with international law, and something about the economic impact of sanctions, although I'm not an economist, but I guess that's for the later discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janne. We're definitely going to come back on the compatibility question that for me it's particularly interesting as well. We got many questions from the audience. I'm going to try to group them a little bit and target, if I may, particularly our panelists with a few questions. We have one that's perhaps for Jan to answer, or one of our anonymous attendees asks, besides the investigation launched by the International Criminal Court, the European Court of Human Rights has also begun its judicial process to deal with the pressing situation. What can the EU do to assist these two organs respectively? And the Russian Federation has withdrawn from the Council of Europe. Does that mean that the court still has jurisdiction over the case targeting Russia, or no longer? I have one question that I would like to target at Viktor. It's a question from Juan Santos. He asks, can we really say that the EU sanctions have been effective? Putin has not changed its way of conducting war. But can we say, for instance, that in the future we're going to have a particular exemption for Hungary and Slovakia when it comes to the next sanction package? Is this something we could conceive? I would also have a question that I would like to target particularly at Anna, which has to do with the impact of the most recent elections at the European Union member states. Two countries are of particular significance here, France and Hungary. Now there was much talk about a possible embargo on oil once we are past the French elections. Can we see that we observe a change in the way that France sees the timetable after Macron has been re-elected? And do we also see a particular change of behavior from the part of Hungary, that after Viktor Orban has been re-elected on that side? Of course, the elections in Germany matter a lot, as we could see, but this happened before the Russian invasion. So I'm going to leave you with those two countries. I have a more broad question to all of you, which connects to many of the questions that are coming from the audience, and also has to do with what Viktor mentioned at the beginning, which is the sort of nuclear weapons of sanctions. Viktor mentioned that the SWIFT ban is not such a nuclear weapon. In that sense, I would like to hear from you, what would be a nuclear weapon of sanctions? Is a gas embargo the case? Is a gas embargo even a possibility? And last but not least, I would like the panelists to come back to that change of rationale that Anna talked about. A change of rationale and sanctions from the objective of changing the behavior, which is something that we see very often, and I understand that's how the larger public sees sanctions, right? We sanction the country because we want that country to change behavior. Once it does change or walks towards changing, like in the case of Iran, we might phase out sanctions. Right, but what if the rationale is what I said, and I do believe it is, that now the most important thing is to do sanctions to increase security in Europe and to defend ourselves. If that's the case, then when do we actually phase out the sanctions? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel where you're going to say now we stop the sanctions, or are we really talking long term here? I'll leave you all with those questions, some targeted, some broad questions, and I suggest we come back to the original order. Viktor, if you may, if you like, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the questions. So first of all, effectiveness. Yes, I think this is one of the biggest questions when it comes to European Union sanctions, whether sanctions are effective or not, and this is especially true when we can see that the ruble is coming back. So the Russian currency is coming back. mainly because, Russia has a lot of goods to sell, including oil. Oil exports in 2021 was something like $180 billion. So that is a yearly revenue for Russia. Also, the liquefied natural gas combined with gas was something like $63 billion a year. So, these are not sanctions. So Russia can generate basically revenue from that. But that doesn't mean that sanctions so far, haven't been effective. Of course, deterrence failed. So if you looked at what happened in December 2021, you could see that the US and the European Union both of them announced that if Russia invades Ukraine, then Russia will face, severe economic consequences. That seemingly didn't stop Putin to invade Ukraine. So from a deterrent perspective, the sanctions have failed. On the other hand, by using sanctions, the European Union can, reinforce its credibility and also send message to other countries that if you do something similar, then you will face severe consequences. Take the example of China. China, I think it was 2 days ago in the Financial Times, the news was that China is looking for possibilities to defend its foreign currency. And by the way, China has the biggest foreign reserve. It has something like $3 trillion in foreign currency. So China doesn't want to replicate the same situation to happen in China than in Russia. So, when it comes to the question of Taiwan, what will happen with Taiwan? There is a debate and there is a discussion on what could the European Union do? What could the US do if something would happen in Taiwan in relation to China? And of course, also look at the case of what's happening currently in the case of the relation between Lithuania and China. The European Commission has developed an anti-coercion instrument, which will be, if it is adopted, will be used against Chinese coercion to defend the European Union's strategic autonomy. But coming back to the question of effectiveness, also sanctions, significantly raise the Russian intervention. So when it comes to, targeting, as we said, the Russian central bank, but probably also the Russian oil, probably, then it will have a significant cost, and it will significantly affect Russia's ability concerning certain actions. Regarding the technicalities, I'm a little bit curious what will happen with Hungary and Slovakia, because the last time that a certain kind of derogation was applied in sanctions, in my mind, was in the 1980s, when back then the European communities applied sanctions against the Soviet Union and also against Argentina. Some of the member states were exempted to apply regulations, but nowadays I don't exactly know how those regulations will not be applied in certain member states. But we'll see, as Professor Wouters also argued. We'll see what happened with Hungary and Slovakia, because at the end of the day, in CFSP matters, you can use your veto power if you will. Now, coming to Gustavo's question, and I'm going to be very quick. So what could be the nuclear weapon of sanctions? Well, basically, if you target the Russian energy sector, and if it's successful, then it can have a devastating impact. Of course, the question is whether Russia can retarget its oil or gas to other countries, to maybe India or China. And nowadays, and very shortly, what we can see is that the infrastructure is basically built towards the West. So Russia will need to build its infrastructure to be able to sell as many gas and as many oil as it wants, if it wants to replicate the same situation. And when will sanctions end? When they're going to lift? Well, there's also a debate on that. On the one side, there are some people that are arguing that that Ukraine should tell when sanctions should be lifted, because Ukraine is basically involved. Others are saying that that the European Union and the US need to decide on that. But as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there is no clear policy line when the European Union and the US will lift those sanctions. So we'll see that, but I'm also really curious what my co-panelists say about these questions.
Thank you, Viktor. Anna, on to you with those challenging questions, if I may.
Sure. Just to start with the first one, very interesting ones in any case, talking about the impact of recent elections and whether this has, we can read the results from the point of view of the decision on an oil embargo. Well, we don't know yet. The oil embargo is under discussion, or that's what we have seen. But of course, it's not a decision that has been made yet. In any case, well, we have had recent elections, as you have mentioned, and the question specified basically in France and Hungary, the most important ones, since we have seen a continuity of the previous governments. So I don't think the line has changed in a radical way that could give us some ideas about a very important change of behavior or change of stance of these two governments. In any case, another thing that I would like to underline and add and even to introduce to bring to this discussion is the question of timing. Sometimes it is true, and I've said that well, in this case the speed was key in the response of the European Union. But sometimes you just need some weeks, some days to understand first the effect of the sanctions you have already adopted. First, to give time to your own operators to get used to the new situation. We cannot forget that sanctions put a big burden on our own operators and on our own private sector, and they have to again. Well, Professor Wouters was mentioning the question of transparency. Well, you have the official journal, but of course, like lawyers or the people working for companies which might be affected by the sanctions, they need to study and to understand the scope of the sanctions, what they imply, and well, for that you need to give them a period of time. And also to governments to assess their own necessities, their own national necessities, so that they can come up with a position when discussing in the council working groups. So, all in all, what I'm saying is that well, we have seen that with the last package, or it's taking a bit longer to decide on to discuss on this last package, sixth package. But I think, in my opinion, it was also it's also something that responds to the needs of a proper assessment of things. Sometimes, foreign policy needs time. We are in the society of we need to have everything quickly, and decisions might be taken automatically, but we cannot forget that whether the interests at the stake are very, very important, not only in terms of security of international policy, but also in terms of the national economic situation and so on. So of course you need certain time just to assess that. So in this context, I don't see a direct impact or change of a stance of these two governments. When talking about the nuclear weapon of sanctions, I don't know if a tactic or a strategic nuclear weapon, we could define that in different terms. But in any case, I don't dare to say anything because, as I said, so many taboos have been directly broken, or we have seen that we have seen things that we would have never respected in this field, that now I don't really dare to make any forecast of what we will see. In any case, what I would like to insist on is that sanctions it cannot come in an isolated manner. They are part of a whole toolbox. So we have to pay more attention to this interplay of sanctions with other questions. It's not that sanctions are going to be the definitive solution for this war, because, well, sadly, it's much more complex, but we have to take them as a part of a comprehensive response. And then just to talk about your questions, to talk a bit about your question of the milestones that we can the phase out of sanctions, if we have already defined certain milestones. Interestingly, I've read some scholars which have defended that in the same way that you define listing criteria, you could also define delisting criteria. It is interesting, I think, from the point of view of perhaps from a theoretical point of view, but it is true that in many cases you don't know how situations might develop. So it can be very, very difficult to define already at the beginning which could be these milestones that you could use to delist. In any case, for instance, the 2014 sanctions were linked at the end with the implementation of the Minsk agreements. I'm sure that there were. I mean, we can easily identify milestones if we start giving ideas of which would be the situation or the points in the development of the situation that would link to a delisting. Well, Viktor mentioned, and I think it's very important to take into account also how well the opinion of the Ukrainian authorities, but probably that will be linked to the peace talks and what will happen on the ground. But definitely, I mean, the first milestone that comes to my mind is as soon as the war stops, and well, it's would be. I think the European Union would be happy to lift some of the sanctions if we achieve this goal. So, but we don't know how much time that will take.
Thank you. And listening to you both, coming to the realization that the current sanctions are not only unprecedented, as Anna said, in terms of the speed and scope, but they're also quite unique because they deal with this particular sector that is energy security, right? And that impacts both the speed of putting sanctions in place, but also the long-term planning in terms of how we roll sanctions back, right? Because at the end of the day, if you decide to rely less on Russian gas and oil, that means change in infrastructure, and that means that even if behavior does change in the long term, the infrastructure will already have changed in a more permanent way, right? So even the idea of rolling back sanctions on the sector of energy starts to make a little bit less sense, right? And in that sense, once you make the decision to rely less, it's kind of what the critical moment, right? Much less than the actual implementation of that. But I'm not a panelist, so I'll move on to Jan to deal with a couple of those targeted questions. Jan, you also get the chance to speak last. So on to you.
Thank you. Well, a few words about the question about the ICC and the European Court of Human Rights. The ICC, as we know, has quite speedily jumped upon the request of nearly 40 countries to open up an investigation. The prosecutor is doing his best with investigative teams, and we know, for instance, that the European Union is trying to help out. For instance, Eurojust, which is the European agency dealing with, say, judicial cooperation based in The Hague, is actually already trying to help out. And the European Commission has recently proposed to extend the mandate of Eurojust in order to basically help it better to participate in collecting and preserving evidence of war crimes in places like Ukraine. So the EU is trying its best to help and support the ICC also in that matter. The European Court of Human Rights is an interesting question, of course, because as we all know, Russia has been kicked out of the Council of Europe. Now, you have to, of course, always keep in mind the treaty articles that are applicable. And there is a particular treaty article at the end of the European Convention, Article 58 of the European Convention, that makes clear that there is in any event a so-called 6 months notice period for leaving the European Convention. What does this actually entail? And there has been a communication about this by the European Court of Human Rights. It basically means that since on the 16th of March of this year, Russia was expelled from the Council of Europe, you have to count an additional 6 months, bringing us to the 16th of September of this year, and all the violations of the European Convention on Human Rights that would occur and are attributable to Russia until the 16th of September of this year, so it can go on for quite a while, are still within the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. So it tells you something about the ongoing role still of the European Court of Human Rights with regard to human rights violations that would take place as part of the war in Crimea, in Ukraine. I hope I answered that question. I'm not sure, Gustavo, which other questions you still would like me to particularly address.
Perhaps you can say a few words on the compatibility of sanctions with the legal framework.
Well, with international law, we, the Europeans, are always very proudly saying that we are respectful of international law. It's written down in our treaties, the so-called strict observance of international law. You find it written down in Article 3, paragraph 5 of the EU treaty, and we pride ourselves of that. I think as such, most of the sanctions adopted by the European Union are indeed in compliance with international law. You know, it's a bit of an evergreen of China and Russia to say that, especially also when late February we had discussions in the Security Council. Both China and Russia again were referring to the fact that in their view, only Security Council backed sanction schemes are legal under international law. But that's not correct. There is extensive state practice that confirms the right of states to adopt unilateral economic sanctions. And so as such, I think the EU is doing a correct job. What, of course, we have to keep in mind is how the discussion would shift in case we were to go to what is sometimes referred to as secondary sanctions. This is a big discussion in international law, and especially we know the practice of the United States under a couple of sanction schemes. There has been in the 1990s the so-called Helms-Burton Act with regard to trading with Cuba. Then there is the Iran sanctions legislation that was strengthened considerably under the administration, and where indeed the secondary nature of the sanctions means that also trading with those countries by say countries like European countries that are not as such within the jurisdiction of the United States, that also for those, say, European companies trading with, for instance, Iran, there may be all kinds of US sanctions applicable. This is strongly contested by the EU itself. At the time of the Helms-Burton Act, there was even a WTO dispute about it. There have been constantly, US presidents who have simply given exceptions to the rule. You may know that the European Union has its own legislation. It's a regulation called the blocking statute, and that basically prohibits European companies from complying with such extraterritorial sanctions of the United States. It's an uncomfortable situation for European companies, of course, because they're a little bit between hammer and anvil. The European Union regulation will prohibit them to comply with the US sanction schemes, but in the US, of course, when they're not complying, they will be subject to all kinds of penalties and so on. So it's not a very comfortable type of situation, and I just hope that indeed in this era where we talk again about strengthened cooperation in transatlantic affairs, that we may avoid, say, undesirable consequences of such kind of secondary sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you, and indeed, to an opportunity to highlight the importance of transatlantic cooperation, even when it comes to sanctions as well. Thank you to all the panelists. I'm afraid we're coming towards the end of our webinar. Actually, we were 10 minutes past the time. We had so many questions and answered. Some of them were hopefully answered indirectly as well. For a certain moment, we had 100 attendees. Thank you so much to the audience for being with us up until now. The good news is that we're going to have a second webinar, this time not on sanctions, but still on the impact of the Russian war in Ukraine, and particularly the impact on the strategic compass of the European Union. So if you're interested on that, have a look at the Engage website, engage-eu.eu. The webinar will take place on the 19th of May, and registrations will be open very soon. Until then, be careful, take care, and goodbye. Thank you so much, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.